Fred seemed more excited about Matilda's football practice than Matilda herself as they walked together toward the changing rooms. His voice brimmed with enthusiasm, lecturing her about the importance of team spirit, about a game that built character, about discipline that stayed for a lifetime. His grin stretched so wide it seemed unrestrained, almost childlike. In contrast to his fervor, the girl appeared entirely uninterested. Every now and then, she would roll her eyes with a sigh that carried both youthful restlessness and a plea for him to stop overdoing it, to stop making it harder for her, to stop embarrassing her by showing so much eagerness in front of others. "Dad, please," she said, suddenly letting go of his hand, her voice soft but firm. "You're embarrassing me." Her words struck him harder than he would ever admit. Fred froze, startled, as though he'd taken a gentle blow to the chest. He scratched the back of his neck awkwardly, trying to hide the smile that crept across his lips, despite the faint sting in his heart. "Where did you get that attitude from, young lady?" he replied, his tone half teasing, half shadowed with a quiet sorrow. The sorrow of a man only just coming to terms with the fact that his daughter no longer saw him as an infallible hero. Their eyes met for a moment, and in hers, he recognized the determination he had once loved so dearly in her mother. He drew a deep breath, wrestling with words unspoken, and then continued more softly, almost conciliatory. "Listen, Tilly, Dad has something important he needs to take care of today. I won't be able to stay and watch your training this time." He paused, swallowing the weight of the admission. "But I'll be here to pick you up right on time, all right?" Matilda regarded him with a raised brow, serious, cautious, like a child already familiar with the truth that promises don't always hold. "Do you promise?" she asked quietly, her voice already tinged with the readiness for disappointment. "I promise, Princess," he said, leaning down to kiss the curl that had slipped across her forehead. His lips lingered on her hair a moment longer than they should have, as if he was trying to draw strength from her presence before he turned away. "Now go on." She stepped back, gave him one last look, a mixture of childlike devotion and prematurely learned gravity, and then waved, subdued, almost adult, before disappearing behind the locker room doors. Fred stood there for a beat, then pivoted on his heel and strode toward the administrative wing of the sports complex with purposeful steps. There was no time to lose. His resolve was palpable, taut in every movement, as he halted before the office door of the headmistress and knocked, noting the cheerful children's drawings taped to its surface. Almost at once, a woman's voice called him inside. "Oh, Mr. Stevenson, what a pleasant surprise." Miss Morris greeted him with a smile that carried both professional restraint and an undeniable warmth. She rose from her desk and extended her hand, her eyes lingering on him just long enough to suggest she was measuring him within the boundaries propriety allowed. "Good afternoon," Fred replied curtly, his urgency clear. "I promise I won't take more than a minute of your time. Just one question, if I may." "Of course," she said kindly, gesturing to the chair across from her. But Fred shook his head with a polite yet firm refusal. No, that won't be necessary. It's very brief." His voice was low, but carried an unyielding firmness. Her gaze rested on him a moment longer than custom permitted, as if trying to read the words he wasn't saying aloud. Fred stood tall, broad-shouldered, his hair the shade of dark honey, and possessed that rare combination of charisma and restrained melancholy in his eyes. His bearing still hinted at the athlete he once was, though he seldom spoke of the past. He was a man who carried weight within him, and a woman like Miss Morris could not remain entirely unaffected by his presence in her office. "It's about that charity match our girls played recently," he began carefully, choosing his words. "Their opponents that day, what school were they from?" She paused briefly, recalling, then nodded. "The St. Juliana School for Children with Special Needs," she said with certainty. "Yes, that was their club's name." Fred's smile was faint, but beneath it pulsed gratitude, mingled with a tension he could hardly conceal. He noticed Miss Morris subtly adjusting her glasses and smoothing her skirt, a gesture unconscious, yet telling. "Thank you," he said simply, then turned and stepped out. The St. Juliana School for Children with Special Needs. The name echoed in his mind, as he was already typing it into his phone. The institution was in London, close enough that he had no excuse not to go. As he exited the building, he ran a hand through his hair, his gaze lingering for a moment on the distant pitch before he resumed his hurried stride toward the car park. His vehicle awaited him, and each step he took felt like part of a plan long in motion, even if he could not yet fully articulate it. The engine roared to life beneath his hands, the steering wheel becoming an extension of his will. He could feel his determination building with every mile, his heart pounding faster, uncertain whether it beat from fear or from hope. Perhaps, just perhaps, He was driving toward the truth he had spent so long evading, toward a part of himself he had once thought lost forever. The nervousness that seized him was not mere excitement. It was that heavy, quiet unrest born in the deepest recesses of the soul, in that dark place, illuminated only by truth. The GPS said the school was only a few minutes away, but time stretched and bent, as though it too knew he was walking towards something that might change everything. He leaned his head back against the seat and closed his eyes, trying to steady himself. But memories flooded him, pulling him back to days when everything was simpler, when life felt less fragile. He saw before him his student years, carefree laughter, libraries full of dreams, and the moment he first laid eyes on Anya Woodberg. She had been with Rosalie, his late wife. They were inseparable, sharing books, space, silence, and a vision of the future. Anya often sat hunched over a book, as though she found peace in the world of sentences, and when she looked up at him, it felt like a challenge, as if she was reminding him not to sleepwalk through his own life. Their words almost always ended at the edge of conflict, and yet, despite everything, he cherished those clashes, because they woke him up and made him feel alive. He was already married to Rosalie when he realized how much Anya meant to him, and it hadn't been a bad marriage. It was calm, quiet, tender. But with Anya, there were cracks that didn't break anything apart, but let the light in. And he thought then, and he thought now, that perhaps in another life, they might have been more than glances filled with tension and conversations ending in silence or in quarrels. But in this life, he had loved Rosalie, and he had lost her. By the time he reached the school, the parking lot was full. He circled twice before finding a spot, and those few extra minutes felt like a reprieve fate had given him, one last chance to ask himself if he was truly ready. He stopped the car, hands resting on the wheel, eyes staring into nothing. He was alone, but what tore at him most was the solitude inside. "Do you even know what you're doing, Fred Stevenson?" he asked himself in the silence, feeling the sweat gather in his palms. He didn't know. He didn't know what to expect, nor why he felt like a boy before his first date. But he knew there was no turning back. He grabbed his keys and phone, drew a deep breath, and stepped out. The air was sharp, clean, striking his face as he looked at the building before him. The School for Children with Special Needs. Behind those words lay an entire hidden reality of children who might never walk, children who would never hear their parents' voices, children who could not see the world, children who had known pain before they had ever spoken. The thought weighed heavy in his mind as he stood at the doors. Then, without further hesitation, he stepped inside. The air burst with the clamor of children's voices, joyful, bright, unfiltered, like a wave crashing against the walls of the hallway, seeping into every crack, whether welcomed or not. Fred walked slowly, each step heavy, almost cautious, as though approaching a place where the truth he had avoided for years would finally reveal itself. The sounds pierced not only his ears, but his soul, because every voice, every peal of laughter, every racing shadow reminded him of what he had never been able to hold on to. When he finally peeked around the corner, his heart tightened, his body froze, as though cut in half by a sudden icy wind. He saw children running, shoving, playing, their faces lit with that unspoiled joy that belongs only to them and to no one else. His eyes searched desperately among the flurry of movement, but Kai was not there. Relief and ache struck him at once. For a moment, he stood motionless, just watching. Those small faces, brimming with play and happiness, carried the marks of lives that had not always been kind. Their strength, their ability to laugh, when they had every reason to cry, broke open inside him like a quiet explosion. He felt gratitude, but also shame. How many times had he forgotten to say thank you? How many times had he stayed silent, believing there would be time tomorrow to speak the words he had swallowed today? But time never asked when it would arrive or when it would depart. It simply passed, mercilessly, bearing the unspoken words deep, turning them into the bones of the past. People live different kinds of lives, he thought as he watched the children. Some race against their days, others know how to pause, and some, like him, have neither, because their choices had long ago slipped from their hands. He was alone, a prisoner of his own thoughts and the silences that bound him. Everything around him felt like an unfinished sentence, a single breath that never managed to say what it must. And then, from that suspended moment in time, a gentle touch on his shoulder pulled him back. He turned sharply, almost startled, and saw a man behind him, about his own height, dressed in sports gear, with a whistle hanging from a chain that jingled faintly, a reminder of the authority he had to maintain before the children. "Can I help you, sir?" the coach asked, his tone carrying the weight of caution, wrapped in polite concern. Fred's face was dry, but his soul was weeping. What could he possibly say? That he was looking for a child he might never have had the chance to know, for eyes that haunted him, and a gait that reminded him of a woman he had loved too quietly, almost sinfully, in its helplessness. That he was searching for meaning in faces that did not belong to him. His lips betrayed him, forcing a faint smile, a smile without warmth, the kind one wears when trying to deceive both himself and another. No, thank you. I was just... His gaze swept once more across the children's faces, as though they might hold an explanation. I was just watching my daughter play. His voice quivered, thin, and too fragile to conceal the storm within. I'm sorry if I disturbed anyone. I'll see myself out. The coach studied him, his eyes flickering with the urge to say something, offer comfort perhaps, or at least understanding, but Fred was already moving down the hallway. His footsteps were quiet, almost soundless, yet they carried the heavy echo of the question that gnawed at him. Who are you, Ephemera 94? It pulsed like a whisper from the deepest recesses of his mind, like a cry with no answer. Perhaps it was a question about Anya, perhaps about Kai, perhaps, most of all, about himself. When the car door slammed shut, the metal shuddered, the sound reverberating through his chest like a blow. Anger surged through his veins, but it was not pure fury. It was the jagged fracture of disappointment, impotence, and grief long suppressed. He had hoped, had nearly convinced himself that he would see her today, just for a moment, just enough to catch her smile, to hear her step, to confirm what his heart had already been whispering. He needed that meeting more than he was willing to admit to himself. But Kai had not been there. It was as if the world had conspired against that single instant, as if some invisible hand kept shifting the strings, denying him the chance to touch the truth. Every piece of information had told him she would be there, yet she wasn't. Fred stared through the windshield at the glass doors ahead, as though an answer, an explanation, a reason might step out of them. The silence was suffocating, and his heart beat unevenly, in the rhythm of broken sentences he had never finished. It wasn't only anger. Guilt lived in him, the kind that gnaws from within, that lodges itself in the bones and scrapes like a rusted blade. He knew he might be too late, that he might have squandered his chance, that he had arrived only to find the door already closed forever. Inside, he was screaming at himself. You're driving yourself mad, you fool. What did you expect, Fred Stevenson? That you could just walk in and she would run toward you, recognize you with eyes in which you yourself don't even know what you're searching for? His feet pressed restlessly against the pedals, alternating between gas and brake, as though in that mechanical rhythm he might release the pressure boiling inside. But everything, in the end, circled back to one name, one face, Kai. The girl he wasn't sure he had the right to call his own, the child whose very existence opened a wound that burned raw inside him. The mere thought that she could be his daughter turned every step he took into an inner rift. He didn't know which hurt more, the possibility that she was, or the dreadful suspicion that he had forever lost the chance to belong to her world. He told himself to let go of Anya, of everything, to retreat into his routines and his silences. But that voice was not reason's voice, it was fear's. Because behind it all, like a shadow that never loosened its grip, loomed the thought that gave him no peace. Hell, who are you, Ephemera 94? A name, a pseudonym, a digital trace, but maybe more. Perhaps a bridge to the past, a signpost to the truth, maybe even the key to Kai. Fred yanked the seatbelt across his chest, fastening it with a violent snap. The sound of the buckle locked into place rang like a verdict. The volcano in his chest still boiled, but outwardly he was only a man leaving, disappearing from the parking lot, abandoning behind him the building, the children, and the question that corroded his being with bitterness. He vanished into the day, carrying within him the unrest of a man who had just stared into the deepest fractures of his own soul. Everything began with a single touch, not particularly remarkable, not bold nor deliberate, but something that resembled a fleeting, almost non-existent contact, something so small it might have dissolved into memory as an insignificant detail of everyday life. Yet it was in that harmless moment, born outside his will and devoid of conscious intent, that a shift occurred, one that would unsettle the foundations of everything he had so carefully built over the years. Fred Stevenson, a man known for his composure, his calm, and a life defined by steadiness, felt something he had never before known how to name. His existence had been harmonious. He had a wife who loved him, a home that stood as a shelter, the respect of colleagues, and students who looked up to him as an example. His routine gave him security, weaving a net of stability in which he felt shielded. And yet one touch, a brief, gentle sweep of his hand through another's hair, was enough to awaken in him an avalanche of feelings he could not control. Never, not in passing, had it occurred to him that another woman could move him inwardly. His life had always been surrounded by beauty, by young women drifting through the corridors of the university, students who came and went, but none of them ever breached his inner world. Not with a glance, not with a word, not with their presence. From the day he had said, "I do," he had bound himself to a set of rules, simple yet unshakable, almost sacred. They had guided him through childhood, through youth and marriage, through the years when he seemed immune to crises and temptations. These rules had guarded him, upheld him, made him secure in his own choice. And then came that touch, so brief, so ordinary, yet enough to unravel his thoughts, to stir what he had long suppressed and hidden even from himself. In Anya Woodberg's presence, everything shifted, everything intensified. Her mere entrance into a room seemed to alter the density of the air. When she stood beside him, he could hear every beat of his own heart, catch every flicker in her expression, notice the slightest shift in her movements. He remembered her hair, once wild and curly, unruly and defiant, then sleek and stiffened with spray, like a stern mark of discipline. But that day it had been soft, delicate, falling across her cheeks like a veil, and that image carved itself into his mind, lingering like a shadow he could not banish. He and Anya Woodberg were not close. Their bond had no deeper roots beyond shared projects and the occasional conversation. They were, in truth, acquaintances, two people inhabiting the same space, carrying out their duties. And yet rumors swirled, whispers linked their names together, as though others knew something he was not ready to admit. Until then, he had brushed such talk aside, dismissing it as idle speculation, the product of other people's imagination. But once that touch occurred, the whispers seemed to change their tone, becoming the echo of a truth he had refused to face. The spring break had offered him the illusion of relief. He returned to his wife, to the peace of home, to the quiet of shared dinners that had soothed him for years. There, he tried to erase Anya from his thoughts, convincing himself that what had happened was nothing more than an illusion, a passing weakness, a meaningless moment. Rosalie asked how things were going at the university, and he replied that everything was as usual. And indeed, outwardly, everything was the same. Yet whenever he closed his eyes, he returned to that touch. He told himself he would have felt the same if it had been anyone else, but he didn't believe his own words. No other touch could have awakened such a storm within him. And then came the leather pants, the loosened buttons of her shirt, and that smile, half-smile, suspended between playfulness and provocation. He felt such things ought to be forbidden by law, for in front of them he was powerless. That was when he understood that it had not been just a touch. It had been a signal, a trigger, a doorway into something he did not know how to halt. He began to seek her company, to savor the moments when he could make her laugh, to measure the worth of his days by the number of times she smiled. And that realization disarmed him more than anything else. Perhaps the truth lay in the fact that their bodies remembered what his mind had refused to acknowledge. Perhaps touches, glances, fleeting moments had gathered in him for years, like an invisible archive, until they reached the point where he could no longer pretend they did not exist. Perhaps the two of them, without meaning to, had long been walking toward one another, slowly and inevitably, like celestial bodies on courses they could not escape. He paced nervously down the hallway, waiting for her lecture to end. He told himself it would all amount to a harmless exchange, that he would ask about a project, a timetable, something ordinary, rational. He hoped everything would remain within the bounds of the usual. But as he thought, he realized that collision required more than his own feelings. If it was to be a collision, she too had to be moving toward him. Otherwise, he remained alone, one heart rushing toward another that stood still. And then the impact would become rejection, pain, an ending. He didn't notice the moment she stepped out of the classroom, so consumed was he by his thoughts. He heard her voice before he saw her. It was soft, gentle, yet so distinct that it rose above the noise around them, the only note his soul could recognize. First, she embraced a colleague, offering congratulations with a smile. Then she approached Sophia, spoke a few warm words, filling the space with the light she carried wherever she went. And then her eyes found him. Fred felt his stomach tighten as she cut through the crowd with the certainty of someone who knew exactly where to find him. "Well done, Fred. You played your part brilliantly," she said with a slight smile he could not read as merely professional. He lowered his gaze, muttered his thanks, and her smile lingered a moment longer, long enough to wound him. When she patted his arm and walked away, he felt a spark there, as if she had branded him with fire. Perhaps she was temptation itself, a demon sent to undo him, or a siren whose voice you didn't need to hear to be drawn under her spell. He was so consumed by her presence that he barely noticed when another hand settled on his shoulder. That touch carried no weight. "Hey, "Fred, you were amazing," came Kelly's cheerful voice. He looked at the blonde, the one he trusted, the one he thought of as a younger sister, though he knew her eyes revealed more than should exist. Why, he asked himself, would he desire anyone else when he had Rosalie? Wasn't she supposed to be his one and only? Foolish thought, he told himself. Of course she was, and yet Anya refused to leave his mind. Kelly chatted about the concert, asked if he would go, but he was distant, far away. He declined, and her smile faded. He knew he had hurt her, but guilt did not rise in him. His thoughts did not belong to her. They did not belong to Rosalie either. They belonged to Anya. And as he walked down the hallway, dodging the feelings he did not wish to face, he moved straight toward the temptation that broke him and drew him in all at once. When he reached her dorm door, it opened on its own, as though it had been waiting for him. Sophia stepped out, smiling, congratulating him warmly. Her touch left nothing in him. The door remained ajar, and he slipped inside quietly, like someone afraid of disturbing the sanctuary into which he had never been invited. Anya was sitting at her desk, slowly gathering her things, and every movement etched itself into Fred with the permanence of a memory that could never be erased. The way a strand of hair slipped across her face, how her fingers glided over the paper, how her gaze swept the room but always returned to the quiet core of her being. All of it inscribed itself upon him like an invisible record, as though everything she was became part of his inner archive. When she lifted her eyes and caught his, a brief spark flickered there before she allowed a smile to form, gentle, fragile, and yet strong enough to send a subtle tremor through his chest, the kind that doesn't topple walls but leaves fractures deep in the bones. "Hey, Fred, what can I do for you?" she asked, her voice carrying the ease of morning and the weight of attentiveness that wrapped itself around him. Each word carried warmth, but also caution, as if she knew that every uttered thought could change the course of the day. He hesitated, struggling to make his words sound indifferent, even as they pulsed within him with the force of all that remained unsaid. "Were you headed somewhere?" he asked, hearing for himself the excessive feeling in his voice, feeling he hadn't meant to reveal. "Yes. I don't want to stay inside. Last Friday, after rehearsal, I lost track of time. They shut off the lights, and I was left in the dark. They said it was a power outage. Waiting wasn't exactly fun." He laughed, intoxicated by the lightness in her voice, and wondered if she had always been so radiant, or if he was only now allowing himself to see her as she truly was, unfiltered, unframed. "That's really lousy," he said, though beneath the simple words hid a childlike wish to erase every discomfort from her life, to wipe it away with his presence. "That's why I decided to catch a little sun today. If the power goes out again tonight, maybe I'll glow on my own," she added, with a smile that wasn't just a casual gesture, but a force settling deep into his chest, stealing his breath. He only murmured, "Smart," and cleared his throat, trying to summon the illusion of control, though he knew she saw him more clearly than he wanted. "Something's on your mind," she said in a quiet, assured tone, the kind of voice that didn't ask for an answer, but confirmed what could no longer be hidden. "How do you know?" "You cleared your throat," she replied with a faint smile. "And I know that look. You wear it when you're unsettled. You know what I look like when I'm unsettled? I know what you look like, Fred. We've worked together, for a long time." Her words carried familiarity, casual yet profound, the intimacy of people who had shared space for years, who had shared quiet moments in the rhythms of work, without needing everything to be named. Fred smiled, aware that she was reminding him of a time he had tried to push aside, a time that nonetheless returned, persistent and demanding. "Not counting that year when you decided you were too good for us," she added playfully, though behind the joke lingered a trace of bitterness, the memory of the emptiness he had left. "I had to work some things out with myself," he said softly, in a sentence burdened with the weight of choices that were never simple. "And you realized it all led you back here?" "I suppose. Well," he paused, wrestling with his own thoughts, with the desire to avoid what was so plainly before them. But her gaze, quiet and patient, left no room for excuses. "Do you love me?" he asked, in a whisper, raw, vulnerable, stripped bare, as though in that moment he handed her the power to decide the fate of everything that made him a man. She lowered her eyes, then, almost tenderly, spoke. "Of course I love you, Fred. You're dear to me. You're a wonderful friend, and I enjoy being with you. We've always had a good rhythm, despite getting on my nerves sometimes." "Yes," he murmured, though his thoughts shifted to the absence he had noticed that day. "Your boyfriend isn't here today." "No, he's away. It's nice to have a day off from everyone, don't you think?" "I know what you mean," he replied, and her smile told him she understood the words he still couldn't bring himself to say aloud. "Of course you do," she said, tossing her hair back, and the scent that reached him was enough to unsteady his breath, as if every motion and every breath she took held the power to throw him off balance. "Will you walk me to my car?" she asked, simply. Yet within that simplicity lay a quiet allure, an invitation he couldn't refuse. "Of course," he answered, even though every beat of his heart warned of the danger in the steps he was about to take, of the uncertainty pulling him forward, irresistible. She walked toward the door with a light, almost noiseless step, but stopped when she realized he was still leaning against it, a barrier she did not wish to go around. Her eyes, quiet and patient, posed a question without words, and within them spilled everything that had smoldered between them for years, touches that lasted longer than they should, glances that lingered until they became almost uncomfortable, smiles that responded to truths that could never be spoken, playful quarrels beneath which a fire had never ceased to burn, all of it condensed into a single instant, into a single breath. Before he could think of the wife waiting at home, or of the girl who had that very day written her trace into his heart, Fred had already leaned in and kissed Anya. The kiss was neither forceful nor reckless, but quiet, almost too brief, yet it carried the weight of a truth that could no longer be denied. When they opened their eyes at the same time, both knew they had just confessed what they'd been hiding for a long time. And as they drew back, the space between them grew saturated with their vulnerability, with a silence in which the only sound was his barely whispered, "Oh God, forgive me." Anya's breath was quick and uneven, yet in her gaze there was no judgment, only wonder and a quiet unease. Fred felt guilt pressing down on him, tightening around him until his very skin felt too small. He was acutely aware that he was now a husband who had stumbled over his own truth and that there was no way back. "I'm sorry, I'm endlessly sorry," he stammered, reaching for the door handle, desperate to flee the space, to flee his own weakness. But her hand stopped him. The touch was gentle, familiar and foreign at once, denying him both escape and excuse. "Why did you do that?" she asked, without condemnation, leaving him to unearth his own truth. "I don't know, actually." "I do," he finally admitted, fighting to swallow the weight of his helplessness. "You do?" He lifted his eyes then, and spoke slowly, as if confessing. "Because you want it." She did not reward him with a smile, nor condemn him with a glance. She only whispered, "I don't." And yet, the very next moment, their lips met again, this time harder, deeper, as if her denial had been nothing but a fragile dam, crumbling beneath the flood of what had been suppressed for a while. Her hand rose to his face, pulling him closer, and as her backpack slipped from her shoulder and dropped soundlessly to the floor, the air thickened, boundaries dissolved, and all that remained was the moment where time ceased to exist, and truth spoke through the silence of their mouths. On the other side of the wall, life moved on in its usual rhythm. People passed, laughter and conversation drifted down the hallway, but here, in the tight, enclosed room, time had lost all meaning. All that existed was the quiet collision of their bodies and their breath, the yearning that had long slept and was now awakening fiercer than ever. Fred tasted Anya's lips for the first time, and that gentle yet insistent meeting of tongues opened a realm where words held no weight. His trembling rose not from his body, but from a deeper place, from that hidden chamber where a man stores everything he never dares to speak aloud. His palms rested against her cheeks, fragile, reverent, as if he held something breakable within them. And yet, every fiber of him screamed to pull her closer, to never let her go. He kissed her with a mix of fear and hunger, and she returned the kiss without hesitation, with the resolve of a woman unafraid of loss, for she knew she had already lost, and who now had nothing left to give but her entirety. Her arms slipped around his neck, seeking refuge, perhaps even forgiveness, never asked for, nor ever granted. As she drew him nearer, their breathing fused, became one, inseparable. Fred understood then that any words would be superfluous, powerless. Everything they had avoided was now spoken in touch, in lips, in the desperate instinct to recognize each other in ways only bodies could translate. He had imagined it might end at the kiss, at that trembling closeness, at a memory to be carried away as one more silence among many he had collected. But then her fingers found the edge of his jacket and began to slip it from his shoulders, carefully, almost ceremonially, as though she was stripping away layers of duty, guilt, and past. Her lips trailed down his neck, tentative at first, then bolder, with each kiss carrying the resonance of recognition, as though she had kissed him many times before, but never quite like this. His shirt slid from his shoulders, and in that brief unveiling, he felt himself surrender to something shapeless, nameless, yet as forceful as a tide pulling him further and further out. His fingers, clumsy with both desire and hesitation, sought the buttons of her blouse, undoing them one by one, removing each barrier with aching slowness. There was no haste, no violence. Everything unfolded in a rhythm that was almost painfully slow, charged with a passion that thrived on patience. The sounds from the hallway had long faded, as if the world itself had abandoned existence and left only the two of them in a room bathed in soft, unmoving light. "Hurry," she whispered, but her voice did not carry the lust he expected. It was the voice of a woman seeking confirmation, of one who could no longer wait for a life that kept slipping from her grasp. He wanted to answer, but words dissolved, scattered, vanished in the whirl of thoughts too afraid to surface. All that remained was her scent, her lips, her body, and his only truth, his only anchor. When her blouse slid from her shoulders, slowly, quietly, like a leaf breaking free of its branch to surrender to the wind, the moment spilled into him like revelation. In that simple image, in the purity of that movement, more was revealed than 1,000 words could express. She stood before him, half uncovered, and in that half revelation, she was whole. He knew then, with a certainty that both terrified and liberated him, that nothing would ever be the same. He kissed her again, this time with complete surrender, with no remnant of control left to pull him back into reality. His lips found hers with hunger and trepidation in the same breath, while his hand buried itself in her hair, clinging as a shipwrecked man clings to his final piece of wood. Almost without realizing, their steps carried them to the bed, and Fred understood then that before him was no fragile memory, but a woman, strong, present, undeniable, and that this moment was not escape, but a return to what had long been waiting. He laid her down with a tenderness that carried reverence, fear, and longing, all entwined in a single gesture unlike anything he had ever known. Her openness, the way she received him, was a sign that all they had wordlessly built finally had the right to be spoken. Their lips found each other once more, and in that union, every boundary of space and time dissolved, as though their bodies spoke a language their souls had too long forgotten. Her hands reached for his belt, not with impatience but with certainty, while he, in the silence filled only with breaths, longed to speak words that might explain, that might give meaning. Yet nothing came. Everything was reduced to touch, to skin that remembered, to a presence that was irresistibly real. Her eyes, bright and luminous, remained fixed on him, filled with conversations that required no voice. In that gaze lay confession, premonition, forgiveness, and he knew then that all he could do was surrender. When she unbuckled his belt and slid his bottoms from him with tender care, he gave himself over completely. Every touch, every motion carried a solemn stillness, as though layers of his past were falling away, layers of a life that was no longer his. When he slipped off her leather trousers in turn, carefully, with patience that held nothing of lust, but rather the reverence of ritual, she stood before him in her undergarments, fragile and powerful all at once, like someone who knew how many boundaries had been crossed and how many still remained. He did not need to ask permission. His gaze was enough. She raised her hands and unclasped her bra herself, unveiling what had long existed only in suspicion and imagination. Fred lost his breath, not because he saw her body alone, but because in that moment he saw her strength, her fragility, her vulnerability, and her power, joined in a single vision. She was beautiful, and in her eyes he understood that this was not conquest, but trust freely given. That moment became their vow, their silence, their new beginning, after which nothing could remain the same. Her hair spilled across the pillow, loose and soft, while her eyes full of longing and trust held him steady. In them there was no haste, no doubt, only a quiet acknowledgement of belonging to a moment that contained everything: the room, the two of them, the unspoken closeness. A thought, suddenly awakened, halted him before that vision. He did not understand how such tenderness had survived in them, how it had endured all the years of silence, or why they had hidden it for so long, as though naming it would cause it to vanish. He leaned down and lowered his lips to her breasts, not with urgency or greed, but with reverence, as if the gesture itself were a rite. His movement sought no hurried affirmation. Instead, he traced her body like a map, each curve bearing its meaning, every kiss becoming a sign of recognition. He kissed the hollow between her breasts, drifted slowly down the line of her body, inscribing with his mouth what silence had kept, patient and ceremonial. He did not rush to where others might, but created space for every sigh, turned each breath into a sentence, and every trembling reaction into melody. Her skin quivered beneath his lips, fragrant with soap, a faint perfume, and that raw, almost primal womanhood no word could contain. His hand traveled down her hips and thighs, with the care of a man touching something both strange and eternally his, while her breath, uneven and almost inaudible, told him there was no need for questions or permissions. His tenderness deepened as he returned to her neck, where life pulsed most clearly, where every vein seemed like a source of something older and stronger than either of them. Her body did not speak in words, but it gave consent plainly, not through dramatic gestures, but through the way she offered her arms, through fingers threading his hair and holding him close, as if fearing he might slip away. He could not stop then, nor did he wish to. When he lifted his eyes again, their gazes met, and in hers there was no shame, no fear, only recognition, understanding, and an unspoken stay. That look was stronger than any words. He inhaled the scent of her skin, intoxicated by the warmth enveloping him, and felt every doubt vanish. In her body, he found not only desire, but trust, the rare surrender that makes a man both weak and powerful at once. "You're beautiful," he murmured softly, with no intent to flatter. The words were not spoken for her sake, or for the moment, but for the truth that had become too heavy to remain unsaid. She smiled with a subtle tremor of lips and body, letting his hesitant yet devoted hands glide down her hips with the care of a painter afraid to damage the canvas entrusted to him. Her body answered in quivers, shivering beneath closed eyes, and when she opened them, her gaze was like the ocean, deep, calm, and full of a plea that asked for nothing but him. "How long has this been going on?" she whispered, her voice like a sigh, fragile and strong at once, carrying the silence of all the days they had spent saying nothing. "I don't know," he answered, looking at her with eyes that seemed to hold the meaning of his entire life, and more. "And you said you didn't want this." "Forget what I said," she whispered back, her smile elusive and gentle, yet as strong as a vow. "Now, please." There was no longer any need for explanations. Their movements became a rhythm unto themselves, a language of bodies that surpassed speech, a harmony that could neither be taught nor rehearsed. In their touch lived everything they had suppressed, everything they had been unable to say, now spilling out in waves of tenderness and desire. The world outside the room ceased to exist. Time withdrew, leaving only the two of them, like two worlds finally converging, without promises and without plans, yet with a truth that pulsed through every nerve and every breath. Tomorrow, perhaps, they would again be what they had always been. Perhaps they would return to their silences and their walls. But in this moment, in this breath, in this day, they had opened the door to something shaped like destiny. And when, with a smile free of bitterness and fear, he whispered, "Those leather pants look good on you," they both laughed. Not the laughter of masks, but the laughter that frees. The laughter of a man who, after long wandering, realizes he has found his way home.